Okay, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to our 167th Capstone Defense. Congratulations, Brett Sweeney, on this very important milestone in the MCM journey, but also congratulations on being the first in your MCM 14 cohort to step up to the plate here. If we're going to use baseball analogies, and you've got your committee here, Professor Dave Scholz, who is your supervisor, has guided you through your capstone, and Professor Jacquie Hoornweg, who is your second reader on this project as well. As we've indicated, you have 25 minutes to present. Once you're done presenting, your committee will then engage you in an oral defense, asking you questions about your research and your presentation. And then we will pause everybody, and then the committee will then deliberate and then come back to you. And we should be done within 1 hour. So do you have any questions, Brett, before we start?
No, I think I'm good to go.
Okay, I just have to. Let me ask for, okay. So you are, I will set the timer now. You can share your screen and you can start when you're ready.
Okay, let me just bring up the slides. I think you can just see the picture of my son, who I invited him to attend, but he asked me, well, is it going to be boring? I said, well, maybe for you, bud. So I don't think he's on with us. So thank you, Terry, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate it. This has been a very long 2.5 years, which surprisingly has gone by in a flash. So it's a weird paradox. I'm very excited to present my capstone research on building public sector reputation and examination of child welfare in Ontario. By way of a quick agenda, so you know what we'll be covering today. Going to look first at the research problem. Why did I want to study this? The literature review, methodology, results, the Child Welfare Reputation Index, which is a tool I developed based on the findings to measure reputation in this sector. And finally, we'll talk about some limitations and hopefully next steps. So to begin, one of my most consistent findings in this capstone is that child welfare is mysterious to most. So I really wanted to define that off the hop and just have everyone on the same page. So children's aid societies in Ontario are those that provide a mandated service, including investigating reports of abuse or neglect of children, looking after children in their care, counseling, supporting families, and even placing children for adoption where necessary. I think the important takeaway from this is that children's aid societies have both the ability and the authority to remove children from their homes and place them into care should the circumstances warrant. What's not included in this? There are a number of child well-being agencies in the province of Ontario, and they provide services directly to Indigenous communities. And as we know, Indigenous communities have a long, complex, and even traumatic history with child welfare. I'm thinking about events like the 60s scoop and the continued overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care today. In 2017, Child Welfare gave an apology for the harms that had been committed and are still being committed against Indigenous communities. So I think those perspectives warrant specific research and are, as such, beyond the scope of this study here today. So why did I want to study this? The field of reputation management is pretty well studied, but I think there are some good reasons to look at managing reputation, specifically in child welfare. Normally, when you think about reputation, you think about companies that you would choose to do business with, those that you might choose not to do business with, or those that, you know, they're distasteful, you might hold your nose, but still do business with them anyway. It's really rare for an organization to say to you, hey, guess what? You're a client. But that does happen in child welfare, particularly with child protection services. As many of my colleagues have said, you know, those of us with children who are under 18 are really just one call away from being involved with the CAS. So this quote here really crystallized my thinking and desire to study this. If the vast majority of your clientele are involuntary, meaning that they didn't invite you into their lives, they don't want you there, and they want to have you out as soon as possible, is it still possible to maintain and cultivate a positive reputation? In this study, I hope to learn better understand the drivers of reputation in child welfare and how and to what extent strategic communications should be part of that management process. Many of the existing models for reputation management look at things like financial performance or benchmarking companies against their competition, which really isn't that relevant for child welfare sectors. This is, to the best of my knowledge, the first kind of its study to look at reputation in child welfare. And most of the literature right now in child welfare looks at the social work practices. But to the extent that it looks at reputation, it mainly focuses on the lens of the media. But as we all know, media is just one input that people consider when making their judgments about an organization. So it'll be interesting to see if whether the existing models can be applied to child welfare or whether there are some considerations that need to be taken into account for these unique organizations. And I did that by setting up 3 research questions. So how and to what extent do CASs manage reputation? So what's done currently? How and to what extent do people assess these organizations? So how do people decide how they feel about them? And how and to what extent should strategic communications be involved? So looking at the literature, wanted to provide you a brief overview. I'm not going to read it all off, but we don't really have enough time, but it gives you a brief sense of the path my literature review followed. And I felt like it had a very logical progression from reputation, both corporate and public, to relationships, the role of public relations, managing reputation, and measuring reputation. It's important too that we define reputation because it can be characterized in a number of different ways. And the majority of definitions would suggest that it involves people's assessments or judgments about an organization. But what I liked about Walker's definition, which separates it from some of the others, is that it's an issue-specific assessment. So if I'm thinking about an example, and maybe this one's a little bit off the wall, but if someone's hair is on fire, but they're standing on a block of ice, you can measure their average body temperature, but that really doesn't give you a sense of the danger the person's in. So I like it being issue specific because it gives you good actionable data by looking at the specific issue. The other piece that I liked is that it's compared against some standard. I mentioned earlier that competition really isn't a factor because each Children's Aid Society is given a geographical area to serve. So they're not competing against one another. Rather, they're looking to adhere to standards set by the Ontario government. When we look at what comprises reputation, we think about von Braun's star. So he would suggest that reputation is the product of the organization's visibility, so how well it's known, authenticity, how well does it follow its core values, mission and vision, consistency, how well does it deliver on promises, distinctiveness, do they occupy a unique spot in the marketplace, and transparency. So that would be how well do they share information. And there are 3 levels of experience that people use to assess these traits that I just spoke about. So the first one is your primary experience. That's your direct experience, whether you're a customer or some way involved with the organization. Your secondary experience, that's your word of mouth and what people read in the media. And then finally, you have your tertiary experience, which is what the organization puts out in mass media. So things like advertising or their social media accounts. When we look at, what's the most important, it's pretty clear in the literature that primary experience is king. Reputation matters to strangers, while relationships matter to friends and associates. And I really like that quote because reputation's a good early barometer to tell you if you should trust an organization. But when reputation meets experience, it's usually the experience that will win because you might have a high regard for a company, but if they treat you poorly, if they don't respond to your inquiries, you're likely to look at them much differently. And Hahn and Grunig characterize successful relationships by trust, satisfaction, commitment, and controlled mutuality, which, as we know, is the ability of each party to influence the other. In terms of the role of public relations in the literature that I found, Traditional thinking in child welfare is that you keep your head down so you don't get it cut off. But the literature would suggest that's probably not the optimal approach, because if there's a vacuum of information, somebody's going to fill it, and you might not like what they fill it with. So as we've discussed so often, PR needs to be out front in helping organizations get out there to the public and put their best foot forward to help them to be more known. And to do that, PR has to be at the management table so they can influence organizational behaviors and make the case to be more publicly available and more publicly accountable. Media, as I mentioned, has been a big focus for child welfare organizations, and typically it has not been kind. Children's aid societies are, I would say, hampered by so much privacy legislation, which is largely necessary. You want to protect people that the populations that they serve, but it can sometimes work against them when it comes to things like tragic events. And so Chennault characterized the interactions with media as the vicious cycle. So a tragic event occurs, CASs can't provide any mitigating factors or contextual information. So media attention really serves to fuel outrage. And that outrage leads to politicians enacting reforms. And largely these reforms are additional compliance measures which add more paperwork to a profession that literature would say is already drowning in paperwork. I mentioned that public sector reputation has to be regarded a little bit differently for public sector organizations. And Whereas and Burke-Jaflot, I hope I didn't butcher their names, came up with 5 different problems facing public sector organizations in the quest for positive reputation. They are politics, so their mandates are largely defined, they can't stray from that. Consistency, people regard public agencies as a whole, so bad actors in one area will reflect on the others. Charisma, the public sector organizations often deal with problems that aren't going to be solved, or at least not anytime soon, such as, well, child abuse, poverty, homelessness, and some of the literature would actually call them chronically depressive because of that. Uniqueness, Fomburn would say that it's important to have a unique place in the marketplace, but people actually have a expectation of sameness for public sector organizations. They want to know that the service they get is going to be the same in Niagara Falls as it is in Toronto and Thunder Bay. The excellence problem would suggest that there are winners and losers in the quest for reputation. So if you claim that you're the best at something, naturally that means someone else is not as good, and that can lead to solidarity problems with your fellow colleagues in the sector. I want to show you very quickly some of the tools that have been developed to measure reputation and some of the categories that they, or some of the factors that they measure reputation against. The part that I really wanted to draw your attention to is that the vast majority of these measure some type of social responsibility or moral dimension, which suggests that ethics are an important part of reputation. In terms of how I went about conducting this study, I'll just remind you very quickly of the research questions. And I went about answering them through 9 in-depth interviews with CEOs, communications directors, and frontline service workers in the industry, and a non-probability sample survey, of which I received 125 responses. And the only filtering question was that the person had to be residing in Ontario, because this was just a study meant to look at child welfare specifically in our province. When we look at the results, I'll draw your attention to the mean or average response on the 5-point scale. You can see there's a high level of support for the concept of children's aid. So CASs perform an important function, they're a good use of taxpayer dollars, and even that authority that I mentioned earlier, there's a good recognition amongst society that sometimes there is a better place for children if they are experiencing abuse or neglect in their homes. But when the rubber hits the road and we ask people, well, how do you view the actual performance of these agencies? We see a decline in the responses. We see lower responses. So do they do a good job of protecting children? Do they use their authority properly? And I think part of the reason for the discrepancy, it can be attributed to the fact that people just don't know enough about child welfare, so they don't know how to assess them. But it can also be a product of the media, because we talked about how the media is generally unkind, and that can serve to depress opinion as well. We look at research question 1. Reputation is critically important because it helps determine whether people are going to trust an organization, and that can have a direct impact on safety. Because if people don't feel like the society is going to do a good job of protecting children, or they think that they're biased or in some other way ineffective, they're not going to make that call, and as a result, a child could be living in unsafe circumstances. The CEOs in particular felt that reputation should not be conflated with being liked or admired. They felt that reputation in child welfare means more so being understood, being respected for being effective, and having the public understand their rights in the process. Again, people don't understand CASs. It's mysterious to people. And again, it's typically opinions are formed through what's in the media, and what is in the media is often those extreme cases. Authority, those interviewed thought that authority was a barrier, and that people think that CASs just swoop in and take children and don't really understand the significant process and don't understand the new direction of child welfare. Whereas perhaps back in the 90s, there was a much lower tolerance for risk. Now the goal, the focus is on providing proactive support so families can be successful with their children at home. In terms of actual management of reputation, reputation is really driven by the service. So if that lines up with the literature, and which says that what we do is much more important than what we say. And so the quality of service provided to people not only impacts their opinion, but it also determines what people will say about the CAS. And part of that too is also being visible within the community. Findings showed that the CAS needs to be part of the community, needs to be a positive citizen, so people are aware of that new direction that I just spoke about. When we look at how citizens view their CAS, most think that the CAS should seek a higher profile. There is a desire for more information. But I would also point you to the second line, which I would recommend the services of my local CAS. I had to truncate that for spacing purposes, but the full sentence is, I would recommend the services for people dealing with parenting issues, poverty, mental health, homelessness, that type of thing. So the mean response of 3.43 might suggest that the message that I talked about CAS as being more about proactive support hasn't really penetrated into the community. When we look at the inputs that help people decide how they feel about CASs, it was clear that third-party endorsement or that word of mouth is so critical. What current or former clients say, what employees say, even more so, very slightly than personal experience. And the only reason that I can see for people to suggest that word of mouth is, very slightly more so important than experience is that perhaps people who took the survey didn't feel like they would ever be in a position to be involved with the CAS, so they wouldn't think that that would be as relevant in their lives. When we look at what's least important in helping people decide how they feel about CASs, again, we see those tertiary experiences. So statements from the government, social media posts, and even information about the CAS, from the CAS, which really points to that need for some type of third-party endorsement. In terms of how people learn about their CAS, most don't, right? The largest proportion of answers said that they rarely hear anything, but when they do, it tends to be information from their friends, colleagues, people who've been involved with the CAS, or speaking with adoptive parents, and you can even see traditional media is in the mix there. The least important methods, again, you would look at information from the CAS, so their social media channels, a newsletter, volunteers, and their website. So again, perhaps they're not so much the master of their own destiny in terms of a communication standpoint, and that we do need that third-party endorsement to develop reputation. In terms of how communications should be involved or public relations, what was clear through the interviews was that communications can support the service. So most felt like we need that general baseline understanding in the community of what the CAS is, what the process is, what their goals and focus is, so we can alleviate fear in the community. So when people see a CAS worker at their door, their first reaction isn't, oh my goodness, they're going to take my children. And again, if this community had more knowledge about how the CAS works, again, that helps to impact word of mouth. Media definitely has a role to play. Not only does media impact the general public, but it impacts staff as well. And that's can be a more insidious impact, because if there's a lot of negative media coverage, it tends to demoralize staff, perhaps not to the point where they're not going to do their jobs as effectively, but it definitely impacts how they advocate in the community. So if someone isn't feeling good about the work that they do, they're not going to talk about it. One of my interviews actually told me that when she was younger in her career and would go out with friends and they would talk about what they did, she would just tell people that she drove a truck. So there's definitely more room for proactive efforts to see CASs get credit for the good work that they actually do. Communications and directors in particular really felt that this was a key point, that CASs need to pool resources together, and they spoke specifically about an I Am Your Children's Aid campaign. And this was several years ago. It was a massive media buy and really aimed at bringing child welfare from the fringe more so into the mainstream by demystifying the sector a little bit. So it's pointing out that people who might have been involved with the CAS, they're your lawyers, they're your doctors, they're your neighbors, right? There's nothing different about them, except perhaps they've had to deal with some additional struggles in their life. They really felt that having so many different CASs saying so many different things was not effective, and that these targeted campaigns really move the needle. Unfortunately, because CASs aren't necessarily funded for advocacy work, the money runs out. But they all expressed a desire to do more of that work in the future. So bringing it all together, direct experience with the CAS matters. People's experience translated to word of mouth, positive experiences driven through delivering on promises, treating people with respect, and having open, honest communication. And of course, clients also want a voice in this process because it involves their family, right? And Hoornweg would call this control mutuality. Again, child welfare is unknown to most. Greater awareness would be supportive of the work at the door, but awareness shouldn't be conflated with actually being liked, more so being respected. So I came up with a reputation index to measure reputation in child welfare according to 5 key factors that came through in my study. That would be awareness, transparency, trust, service, and compassion. Each factor would be evaluated by testing people's opinions based on 3 statements on a 5-point scale. So then you would take all the points achieved and divide it by the total points available to get a reputation score in that specific area. Because like Walker had said, it should be issue specific. So I would evaluate child protection services different than I would adoption services, or perhaps even donors' opinions. And here are some of the statements I developed to evaluate these factors. I won't read them all, but I'm happy to return to them later if you'd like. In terms of next steps, I'll start with the limitations of my study. The survey results are not generalizable. As a non-probability sample, we can really only draw conclusions based on the group that took the survey. Along with that, there was a small percentage of people from visible minority groups who took the survey, approximately 6%, give or take. My interviews with my professionals in child welfare would suggest that people from marginalized or minority communities are the most likely to be involved with the CAS from a child protection standpoint, and are also the most likely to harbor some significant fears or have some preconceived notions about a CAS. So I think further research there is warranted. And as well, the study did not include Indigenous groups. In terms of future research, I think there's room to obviously do some more research to understand the perspective of Indigenous peoples and visible minorities, but also would like to do some content testing to confirm the conclusions of the study. This would also allow us to add some weighting to the scale, so perhaps one factor is more important than some of the others. In terms of knowledge mobilization, I would like to pilot this at my own organization to get some of that on the ground experience to see how it seems to fit and does it actually accurately capture the things that we're looking to measure. As well, there is a provincial association, the OACAS, which has different provincial tables. So executive directors and communicators, of which I'm a part of in my daily career. So I would like to present to both of them, test some of the theories against, their on the ground experience, and see if this is something that we can, as a sector, begin to move forward with. With that, I would like to say a sincere thank you to all my professors, the TAs, support staff, my colleagues. I'm part of an incredible cohort. I've heard about some of their research. I think they're really going to wow you. So look forward to that. And a very special thanks to Dave Scholz. I would have been very lucky to work with any of my professors, but I've got that on the ground experience with Dave. So I will contribute to his reputation by saying Dave was absolutely fantastic, completely. He was very available, always insightful and helpful. And I don't think this project would have turned out as well without him. So thank you. And I'm happy to take your questions.
Thanks, Brett.
Well done. 24 seconds left. Good job. Like that. So thank you very much, Brett, for that very insightful and interesting research that you've done. Turn it over to Dave Scholz.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. That's professionally delivered. Amazing to work with you as well. So I'll contribute to your reputation as well. This was a fantastic project. Even when one or the two of us forgot that we had a 6:30 meeting on Thursdays and didn't show up till 10 minutes later. So we made it through it. Quick question for you. So I love the one slide where you talk about reputation is related to strangers and relationship is related to close friends. And then I look at your 5 measures, and you have measures in there that would be leaning more towards measuring relationships, and you have some that would be leaning more towards measuring reputation. Can child services do both? Build relationships as well as build reputations, do you think? And how? What's the, to a sense of where would they start?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah, it's important that the scale measures relationships, right? The literature would suggest that, we're judged more on what we do rather than what we say, but relationships also determine that word of mouth. So I think that's key. And because, as you saw in my study, that information directly from the CAS is not seen as impactful, it's important to have that third-party endorsement, get that good word of mouth. But I'm not sure if we'll ever get to that state where, people feel very warm and fuzzy about the CAS. There's still that authority piece. There's still that power imbalance that makes people somewhat uncomfortable. But I think, as the CEO said, that's really not what they should be striving for. If I think about it, we all have someone in our personal or professional networks who, isn't the most warm and friendly, but you respect them. You would turn to them for help and advice. So you might never be best friends, but you can still have a healthy relationship. So I really think that's what the CAS should be striving for. And I think I would align with what everyone told me in my interviews, is that it all starts with service, right? So we have to make sure that in everything that we do, we are treating people with dignity and respect, and making sure that they feel like they've got a voice in the process. And that is going to radiate out. And so I think that's really where we need to be, but also that baseline piece of understanding. So there is a role for some of those communications that perhaps are not as well regarded. So information directly from the CAS. So getting the word out there about what the process is. A lot of the frontline service workers talked about needing to pull back the curtain so people understand what's going on, and they understand what their rights are, and they see that the worker empathizes with them, right? So some of them really use the words like understanding their pain. So I really feel like those relational pieces are critically important, rather than maybe some of the other ones that are more generalized, because really people judge these organizations based on that very intense personal experience that they have with them.
And so with that intense personal experience, and you talked about measuring, specific instances as opposed to an overarching measurement. And I like that approach in this case. But those are intense emotional moments for some people. And then you say reputation's driven by the service of it, and you can't talk about that aspect. You can't individual cases. So you're kind of left at the whims of what media wants to report on. It's an uphill battle then, is what I'm hearing a little bit, even to get to that neutral level of just recognition.
Yeah, I think it definitely is, because there are some great stories that just can never be told. But I think, Dave, though, there are opportunities for good stories in the media, and not all of them involve privacy. So if I think about stories about foster parents, because CASs all maintain a roster of foster homes, so you can tell the stories, assuming there's consent, of foster parents who have done wonderful jobs caring for children. In my own agency, we had one just retire after 50 years of service, right? So you can think about the knowledge and the things that she has seen over these years, right? So I think that's a wonderful story. With consent, you can tell stories about families who have been brought together through adoption, and the success and the harmony that's created in their lives. Youth who have also reached the age of consent, they can also decide to tell their stories, and certainly some will be doing that when they come back for we have a spring gala coming up, and so a youth is going to come and talk about her experience. So those can be told, but you can also talk about some of the programs, and that's maybe not as interesting. But I think when we talk about the relationships to minority communities or Indigenous communities, and how we need to do things differently to further that journey towards reconciliation, I think those are some really interesting stories. And the vast majority of them, which I like, particularly in the case of the foster homes or the youth who have come through the system, it's that third party endorsement. So it's not the CAS talking about what they do or how great they are, but it's people who've actually experienced the system.
Perfect. Thank you, Brett.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dave. Jacquie, over to you.
Yes, thank you. First of all, great job, Brett. And those who are on the call but didn't get an opportunity to read the paper do not know the depth of the literature review upon which this was based. So I just want to say, kudos to you for putting that together. And I want to just also add that, when I think about what makes a good capstone or what makes competency in anything, really, it's a combination of intellect that's put to it, emotional intelligence, EQ, and then there's also hard work. And in your paper and, the thinking and the analysis that you did, even the analysis that was in the literature review, I just think I can see all of these pieces. And I think as public relations practitioners, it's when we do those three things and roll it up into a really good, clear story, which you have lots of competency in. So just wanted to say that off the top.
Thank you.
Really, really great. There were, and also like even during your presentation and reading your paper, I wanted to talk with you about this. So I think also another really good sign that you're getting to some of the meat of some of the issues. And I want to go back to what Dave's question was and talk about what really I see as two different audiences and stakeholder groups, publics, within your paper, one being the actual clients and people who are working directly with the child services, and then the second one being the public. And I want you to just talk a little bit more about, like, just build on some of the things you talked about in terms of the importance of reputation with both of those and how that connects together.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for your kind words, Jacquie. I appreciate that. I think particularly as the frontline service workers talked about, it's when they go to the door, right? People are typically afraid of the Children's Aid Society, right? They think that the worst thing possible is going to happen to them, and that maybe they don't have as much of a voice in the process. Some of the literature that you referenced, really, there was some really powerful quotes from people who said, you know what, I'm just so afraid of the power that they have that, I think it went as far as calling it tyrannical, that type of thing. So if people have that impression, if people are worried about that, it is going to be so much more difficult for workers to get in the door and to work with them. And they all talked about they've got the power to compel cooperation, but that leads to much worse outcomes. It is better when they can have that mutually beneficial relationship. In the literature from Hung, she would call it a covenantal relationship where everyone's working together towards a shared goal, which is that children are thriving, right? So I think reputation is critically important at the general level. So when people are thinking about the Children's Aid Society, if they see a worker coming to their door, it doesn't give them that, intense feeling of panic or pain, because they know that the direction of the agency is to provide support. So if I think about like a food bank, right, there might still be a stigma associated with using a food bank, but people recognize that it's a necessary service, right? So they might not want to have to use a service at the time, but they're happy that it's there for them, right? And so I think that would be a good goal of reputation, perhaps so they're looked at more of as a community resource. And in fact, many of my colleagues and some of the people I interview would say that Children's Aid Societies are the social safety net behind the safety net, right? So if they can have that type of reputation, I think it will help with the service, but also, again, as you mentioned, the direct relationship with the individual clients is so key, because that will translate into word of mouth, because unsatisfied clients are likely, especially these days, to take to Twitter, to take to social media, and to talk about their experiences, right? And media is typically more sympathetic to individuals who say they've been wronged by a system. So it's so critically important to have both, right? So that overall piece, so people feel like the CAS is a support and can help them rather than punish them, and also on the individual level, so they feel like the CAS has done a good thing in their lives and supported them and helped them through a time that they otherwise might have struggled.
So in your presentation, I think it was somebody gave you the feedback that, we don't need to be liked, we need to be respected. I want you to think about if we slightly change that to be, we don't need to be liked, we need to be trusted. I'd like to get your thought on that, and how both the relationship with the broader public, as well as the client specifically, might support those relationships with the clients ultimately.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Jackie. I think, though, trust and respect are closely related. If I think about just my own personal experience, if I think about someone I don't respect, it's largely because I don't trust them, right? So I think there's some intertwining there, but I take your point, and I think absolutely trust is critical, because one of the CEOs put it a particular way, said people might trust us, but what is it that they trust us to do? So meaning, do they trust that they'll come in and swoop in and take your children? Or do they trust that you'll treat them as individuals, look at their circumstances, provide support? And, if a situation just can't be mitigated, then there's another process for that. But so I think the nature of trust is so important. And that building public trust in terms of getting that messaging out, that third-party endorsement of people who've had the good experiences, that all goes a long way to say, well, if they treated that person well, I'm hopeful that they'll do the same for me.
Yeah, and I think, if we think about the steps of true communication where people, finally get to a point of really believing something, so not just hearing it, but actually internalizing it, and thinking about through how you get there it's partially media and so on, but so much of that is about interaction. And, the big challenge that you have here is not unlike some other sectors where the only time people hear about it is when there's a problem. And otherwise they don't really have time. Like you said it really well in partway through your presentation, that for a lot of people, they don't see it as being part of their life, so they don't think about it. So really your challenge is that the only time that they ever hear about it is when something goes wrong, and then they only notice it because it's unusual. So the challenge that I think for the child services really is that how to get an internalization for people of the broader story, which generally means connecting them in some meaningful way in their lives, which is not necessarily going to happen through media. So I think there's a huge piece here that potentially you could take to the next step at some point in your career, in terms of thinking through that broader publics, the role of that relationship with the public in getting into what the relationship is with the clients. And just overall, like, great job. And thanks very much for this.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jackie. We're coming up on our time, but Brett, let me ask you the question in terms of building a coalition of support within the societies to be able to amplify this messaging as well, right? And to see, the work of one organization to try to do this is pretty hard, especially in Southern Ontario, where there seems to be overlapping or abutting jurisdiction as well. So you said you inferred that there was some kind of campaign before. What's the likelihood that that campaign could be mounted again? And to what degree would that then support the kind of work that each of the individual groups could do?
Yeah, I think as Jackie had mentioned about connecting people to the work, that's what that campaign really tried to do, is create those connections by giving the people that general understanding that anyone you deal with could be someone who's been impacted by a CAS, right? So that, we all have some type of connection or interaction. But Terry, what you said really triggered something in me about having that coalition of support. And one of the things that has been critically important, and I'll come back to the campaign, but one of the things that has been critically important is for CASs to work cooperatively with other organizations in their sphere, right? So in their local communities, they're working with mental health organizations, they're working with regional governments on housing issues. So there's a potential within your own community for a type of campaign from all these organizations that are working to provide social assistance in one form or the other, right? But there's room for that consistent messaging. And certainly one of the things that CASs have to look at right now, and this might be where a campaign goes in the future, is recruitment of foster parents, because there's a great need across Ontario. It's not localized anywhere for new foster parents. So they'll be looking at ways that we can, streamline messaging, have consistent messaging, and give people that regular touch point so they, again, can experience that sameness of service, right? Which the literature would suggest is important. So I think there's lots of things that can be done locally and sort of on that broader provincial level.